Yeah.
Alrighty, good people, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome. Thank you for coming this evening on this night where there is no football game. So I applaud
that's
your choice. So I want to give a little bit about why we're here, particularly if you were not part of the Occupy Box series last fall and last spring. So the whole story behind this started the summer of 20 in the wake of the George Floyd murder and the resulting protests. We kind of got together for our usual happy hour and had a little chat about what we can do using our expertise to shed light on the social injustice that was plaguing our country. So out of that conversation, the Occupy Box series was born, and we took as our inspiration the teach-ins from the 1960s in which professors began organizing these discussions in a public setting, just like we are here tonight, to sort of shed light on social injustice. So since the events first started at the University of Michigan in 1965, teach-ins have had a long tradition of peaceful protest and activism on college campuses in the US. So tonight, our particular focus was driven in large part by some of the, I'll use the word chaos of this past summer with regard to critical race theory. And whether it should or should not be taught in schools. The debate, which we all diligently sort of followed on various social media and news networks, made it abundantly clear that most people do not know what critical race theory is, and that number two, a great many people don't exactly know what's being taught in schools in the first place. So part of that was also that most people do not understand what history is to begin with. It's often conflated with the past and with nationalistic mythology. So those misunderstandings serve as the foundation for our panel here this evening. So as Northwest faculty, we're both professional historians and scholars as well as professional educators. And so our panel this evening is organized around that dichotomy. We'll begin tonight with sort of a broad discussion of what history is and what diversity is and what they mean to us as scholars before segueing into a conversation about what it all means in the classroom specifically. We hope this can be a respectful, non-combative dialogue in which we all engage in asking questions about the role of history and the importance of diversity and social justice. In that spirit, you are encouraged to raise your hand and ask questions throughout the discussion. It's not just us sitting up here talking at you. We do want you to engage with us and talk with us about this. I know a great many of you in this room are education majors of some shape, form, or fashion. So we value your input and your contributions to the conversations. So before we begin, it's probably useful for us to introduce ourselves and who we are and our area of history and when we started teaching history in general and we started at Northwest. You guys got that? Who we are, our history area, and we started teaching. So I'll start. I am Dr. Dawn Gully. I'm the chair of the department, but I'm also our resident ancient historian. I specialize in Greece and Rome. I have been teaching ancient history in some shape, form, or fashion since 2000 and have been here at Northwest since 2009.
My name is Matt Johnson. I teach world history. I've been here, I think, 1999.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sarah Naramore. I am a historian of the early United States. I'm also our historian of science and medicine. I do not have as impressive a teaching history as my colleagues. So I finished my PhD in 2018 and I started at Northwest last year. So 4 years total, almost, and 1 year at Northwest.
My name is Dr. Rob Voss, and I teach social science education. And my area of specialty is 19th century America. My research area is railroads and coal mining and Native America and power and various things like that. As far as teaching goes, this is my 22nd year of teaching. In general, this is, I started Northwest in 2013, and I earned my PhD in 2013. So I've been teaching all different levels before that, and then now at the collegiate level since 2013.
I'm Ms. Turnus. I'm everything. That's what I am. I teach Western Civ, soon to be World Civ, US Survey, Economic History, Race and Ethnicity, Latin America. I teach a little bit of everything. I first taught in 2005, and I started here as an adjunct in 2008 and full-time in 2014.
Hi, my name is Alyssa Ford. I've been at Northwest since 2011, and I teach a variety of things, but I'm a women's historian and a public historian. So public history is history outside of academia. That's what I do.
I'm Dr. Devlin Schofield. I teach modern European history. I'm a historian of modern Germany. I started out my teaching career as a teaching assistant at Michigan State in 2008, and I joined Northwest in 2015 after I got my PhD.
I don't know if you caught this, but we took the 2 Europeanists and we bookended the whole thing. So we basically trapped the American historians in the middle. So we've done that. All right, so we're gonna start with an easy one, or perhaps it's actually the most difficult question we'll ask this entire evening, right? What does the term history mean to you? Not everybody at once. I will start. All right, so as an ancient historian, I get to, my people get to claim the origins of the word to begin with. The Greek word historia first appears in the 5th century historian Herodotus, and it literally means inquiry, asking questions, right? Asking questions about the human past. And so for me, history is a critical analysis of the human condition in an effort to make sense of the present. You don't study the past just to go, ooh, Caesar was assassinated, right? The important thing is, why the hell does it matter today? And so it's the bridging of the gap between the so-called past and the present in an analytical way.
Well, history for me is observing change over time, right? And I also think that history is a mechanism to bring about societal change. Building on what Dr. Gilly said, in terms of why we study the past, I talk to my students about this. I haven't tried to imagine somebody walking down a sandbar and they're kind of confused where they're at. One way of figuring out where they are is by looking at where they've been. By figuring out that position to now, you can kind of see a trajectory of where we're going. And at that point, you can either do a corrective and change that trajectory or continue on that track. And that's why I think history is important. It's very, very much now oriented, right? I think it's a mechanism to change so that we can bring about that positive element of history and change society for the better.
Anybody want to add?
I'll keep going. Since those of you in my historians craft class know that we spent 3 weeks asking what history is. We will not spend 3 weeks today, but I think, going off what Dr. Gilly and Mr. Johnson said, I also like to emphasize, like, history is how we extend our experiences. We only individually have one life to live and one set of experiences. Studying history allows us to, expand that, to identify patterns, to figure out where we are on that sandbar, and use evidence. And it also helps build empathy across time and space and in the present as well.
Hence the message shirt. We historians like to make t-shirts for everything.
Dr. Gillen, before you move on, I want to add like a different component
Oh, go ahead.
to that. So something I always like to talk about in especially my US survey classes, is not just like what history is, but how history is produced. And what I mean by that is not like how the events are produced and happened, but how we know about that stuff, right? Because anything we're talking about as being history that we know about it because of records, because of evidence, because we have decided to study it. And all of that is about the ability of people to kind of document that material, and the ways in which people in power, and that includes us as historians, have decided whether we find that information valuable to study or not. And so when we talk about history, it's entirely about power, and that goes directly into the issues of diversity that we'll be getting at today. So it's thinking about, it didn't just happen and therefore it is, and we know it because someone allowed it to become knowable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to add on to that, for me, it was, my brain was rocked this last year watching, all of us, I think, are constantly reading and watching and paying attention to text and narrative and all sorts of stuff. And for me, I encountered a historian whom I should have encountered earlier, Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, and he wrote that his history means both the facts of the matter and the narrative of those facts. So not just the thing that happens, but also talking about the thing that happened. And I agree, it's about power. Whose story is being told and how are we choosing to tell that story? And I think understanding that and whose story is being left out, I think that's a major piece of our understanding of history and what history means.
I think in terms of the conversation this summer, I saw a lot of tweets. Yes, I'm on Twitter. There's a lot of tweets that were sitting there talking about, oh, well, that's revisionist history. They're reshaping history to their own narrative. All history is revisionist history. All of it. That's the only thing we all do. It's constantly changing. So I actually take exception to that quote, Rob, about fact, because what is fact itself actually changes over time, depending upon who's in power and who's interpreting the piece of evidence, so on and so forth. One of the sort of biggest things, and sorry, ancient world people are getting ready to hear it again. The sort of chairman, if you will, of our national organization, Jim Grossman, likes to have this whole everything has a history. That phrase drives me batshit crazy. Not everything has a history, everything is past. Humans have history because only humans can create it. So there is this element of humanity that is embedded in this notion of history. And it ties everything that we've just said together, which then sort of pops us into this question about diversity and the role that diversity has within our field. But the other, of course, the big problem is it's not ever really clearly defined, right? So who wants to take a stab at defining it?
Defining what?
Diversity.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, we're jumping around, like, don't skip around, I mean.
No,
Come on, give me a list for a reason. I'm just
So
saying.
I'll start then. I'll take the first shot here. So to me, diversity is acknowledging and recognizing the host of people's voices and stories that make up the history beyond the voices of the powerful. And in my own work, I'm concerned with people on the margins. And I think it's maybe worthwhile to identify what I mean by margins. So margins can be, it's an elastic and it's a situational contingent concept in terms of, it can be geographical in terms of it's just space from the center, from the capital, but it can also refer to the position of people in relation to the larger group. So minority population, the way that this position they occupy in their own communities. And so they're marginal, not in the sense that they are unimportant, but marginal in the sense that there are people who often experience discrimination, people who are often identified as people who are acted upon rather than historical actors themselves. And so I think it's important for us to focus on these people who are traditionally seen as unempowered, and to see the ways in which they exercise agency, the way that they pushed back. So I think focusing on the margins actually tells us a lot about power as well. I think it calls into question, does the state live up to its rhetoric that it has? Does it live up to its stated ideals? And I think the result isn't always uplifting, but it's not always discouraging either. So I think it's an important reminder that when we focus on the margins, we're talking about something that's continually shifting and populations that may occupy that space sometimes, but not at others.
So based on everything you've just said, how does all of that apply to your own research area? I mean, you're a modern Europeanist, you teach our Holocaust class. So how exactly does all of that apply to your subfield within history?
So are you talking about my Alsatian veterans then? I didn't think I was going to get to.
You got 30 seconds. Go. No, I mean, seriously, how does it apply to whatever it is that interests you, that drives you in your own study? And then we'll later, of course, bring this back into the classroom, but how does that impact how you study and how you look at what it is that you study?
So for my 30 seconds on the Alsatian veterans there, the rhetoric that either Germany or France utilizes to say that these are in fact Germans or French people in the borderlands. It's one thing to say it, but it's another to actually put that into practice. And when you see like the crisis of war or something, you find that the state, its actions suggest that it doesn't actually believe its own rhetoric, and it's not as inclusive as they might lead us to believe. But when the people on the margins, for instance, in History of Holocaust today, we discussed a book by Marion Kaplan, Between Dignity and Despair, that focused specifically on Jewish women's experiences in Germany up to and during World War II. And she emphasizes really how gender affected the experience that people had within Germany, within the Jewish community, and just showing how gender played a fundamental role in how people reacted to the discrimination that they faced, but then also how it changed them and how they were able to push back and exercise a degree of agency when you might not necessarily think that that's actually available to them.
Anybody else?
So I'll jump in with some of my stuff, and I'm sure Dr. Vossel had similar experiences with his work too. I mean, my work within rodeo is exactly this, right? Like I look specifically at groups of people who have not been traditionally welcomed into mainstream professional rodeo, which is almost entirely white. And so I am constantly looking at and looking for and trying to talk about and finding material on these different groups of people in different rodeo circuits. Because very rarely have they been deemed important by an archives or a library or a museum that's not interested in collecting their materials. And so there's not like the traditional archives that you get to go to that you're maybe thinking of for other history projects. In addition to like the study of that, and I think everyone, regardless of your own identity, needs to be studying and be learning about kind of diverse sets of people, because, and that can be race or sexuality or religion or all of these identities, because that is who we are as a people today. It's also who has existed in this place of the past. But in doing so, as a historian that does this work, within US history, I think especially within the American West and history there's a lot of conversations about who should be doing that study as a historian, right? As someone who is white and looking at Black rodeo and Native American rodeo and these other circuits, there are conversations, and there are certainly other historians and academics who, like, within this, like, America as this post-colonialist society where we're like overcoming a lot of history of oppression and domination by people who are white, there's something pretty uncomfortable about it still being someone who's white who's telling those stories, right? There's a continued power dynamic and power imbalance that is there. And so that's something that I think about in my own work that I do when I'm talking about other groups of people that I am not a part of. So it's a conversation. In my next book, I'm looking specifically at gay rodeo, and I'm co-authoring that project. I'm a part of the LGBT community. My co-author is not. And we had a conversation about how she included something on gay rodeo in her first book, like I did, but she felt a little bit uncomfortable about whether she was the right person to go forward with a full project on her own because of that. And it's a really different kind of conversation than people in like more ancient history have.
Oh, no.
Because it's, well, but like in terms of like, it's very there in American West and other US.
Oh, yeah, it's an extremely uncomfortable conversation to have. It's one that's really important to have, but for my own work on Native American, I paused. I took a long time to really think through, should I be telling these stories? I mean, I had some internal struggle over being the one to tell these stories. And then as I dug into it, I started to understand how, at least for some of the people I was telling the stories of, that it's still an uncomfortable conversation to have within these people. So for example, there's one guy that I like to talk about, his name is Elias Boudinot. I learned this, he's not French, he's Cherokee, but he called himself Cherokee, but now the Cherokee Nation disowns him. So does he count as Cherokee? Well, I don't know. I get to make that argument that, yeah, for my book, for my work, he does count. He self-identifies this way for all these reasons he counts. But within the Cherokee Nation, he doesn't count. And so who belongs and who doesn't? And this is an issue of power and understanding, and it's difficult. It's not easy. And it is an uncomfortable it's uncomfortable to talk about, and it's important to get it right, which is also part of that pressure. For those of us on the outside, we're like, okay, I don't have as much leeway because I need to make sure I feel the pressure to get this thing right. And it's uncomfortable, it's hard, but that's part of what we've chosen as a profession, that this is hard and it's important to do.
It's interesting that you both, sorry, Sarah.
No.
It's interesting you guys both mentioned that because I come at that from another perspective. I mean, I'm a political and military historian of the Hellenistic age, Alexander the Great. I'm one of 4 females in the world that work on that. So I come at it from, I'm the actual minority, setting foot in this incredibly old white dudes kind of field. And it's sort of, I have to deal with sort of that particular gender dynamic. At the same time that, you know, my own subfield, ancient med studies, is really sort of having its come to Jeebus moment right now. Like we've literally decided it's no longer appropriate for us to call ourselves classicists or classics. No. That's white supremacist. We got to get rid of it. So we're having this moment where it's like, what exactly is it that we do? Because so much of our history is written by the upper class white dude. And that's what has come down to us. So how exactly do you get at those marginalized voices? I mean, as a woman studying the ancient world, already you've got the marginalized piece, the marginalized voice in there. But in my field's mind, I hate to use this phrase, here we go, my sphere is that I should only be talking about women. Been told that actually at a conference by a man. As a female, I should only be talking about women and children. What business do I have sitting there looking at, you know, how Alexander the Mediocre used the phalanx? You know.
I'm another woman writing about a dead white dude.
Yeah.
My subfield is not quite as bad. I have not actually been told I should not write about Benjamin Rush because I'm a lady. I will say that I think I'm the first person to take his wife seriously as a contributor to his medical thought, which maybe has something to do with getting other voices in the room. But I think in American history as well, there's this, there is the struggle that Dr. Ford and Dr. Voss talked about. There's also the struggle thinking do we need another book about a dead white doctor? Somebody who was in power and influential. And how do I write that in a way and do my work in a way that is useful to the moment now? And I think it is, but I had to sit down and sort of, a different sort of hard conversation thought with myself and hard conversations in my field. But part of it is taking that and looking at the sources we have. I talk to my students about this. sorry, this is getting into class stuff, but, taking the resources we have and interrogating them and asking questions in a different way, saying, how does this affect things in the long term? Why does it matter that Benjamin Rush is talking about Blackness the way he does in 1790? Which is important because those 3,000 students he had fan across the country and start sharing those ideas with patients, with friends, with their students, and we can see these ideas perpetuate going forward and are still affecting us now. So I think, yeah, it's sort of the opposite conversation, but it's also ongoing. And in a field where we tend to study things like institutions or how institutions shape ideas, it can feel very far away from humans' lived experience. But at the same time, what's great about history of medicine, at the end of the day, it's about bodies, and we all have bodies.
Sure. Anybody else? Sarah, you touched on the what drives history, is the change over time, and I know that Matt's mentioned it as well. How has our understanding of diversity and its relationship specifically with history changed over time? I mean, we can all go back to the French and Allies school, which is all about you guys have heard the phrase top-down history, right? Which is most of what's been studied. The French and Allies school was all like, ooh, bottom up, gotta do it from the bottom up. But bottom up as long as you're white, right? And then we get the social turn in the 50s and the 60s in this country, and you have this explosion of scholarship. And some fields have jumped on board with that and run with it. Some, like mine, are going, oh, what'd y'all do? And are just now looking at it, right? So, sort of the question for the floor here is, how has our understanding of diversity within our own respective subfields changed in terms of what it means to do history?
I can talk about economic history a little bit if you want, because that is one that is changing dramatically right now, especially in relation to slavery, the Civil War, that sort of thing, right? Until about 20 years ago, the majority of that conversation was all about here's what slavery is and here's how it fed the economy, but it only had stuff to do with what's going on in the South. It had nothing to do with what's going on in the North. In the last 20 years, that has changed dramatically as they are starting to make connections between, right, southern cotton plantations and northern cotton factories, right? So they're making cloth out of stuff. And so that dynamic is really shifting a lot. Something that was completely ignored, right? We celebrated the North for industrialization and factories and, free labor, when the reality is all of that was based on slavery in the South. So even in the last 20 years, the diversity of that study is changing dramatically.
Would you say that what has really happened, I think, since the 60s is that diversity in many respects has come to mean how we are all interconnected, no matter race, color, gender, religious belief, whatever the list goes on.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's the complexity of it, right? We're getting away from that simplistic narrative of, A happens, B happens, C happens, and then here's the result. Back to a more complex understanding of relationships between all of those pieces that it's.
And that's our job up here is to, we're not here to simplify things, right? In history classroom, that's not what we do. We're here to complicate students' understanding of of history, because your thinking should be more complicated as you are progressing through education, right? So we want to demonstrate that this thing is much more complex, much more interrelated than you have been previously exposed to, right? That's the point, to make you uncomfortable, to make you think outside of what your usual norms.
Yeah. Step outside of yourself a little bit. Yeah.
I just want to ask kind of the panel, like, as historians, and you guys have been continuing your own education, and then also educating students here at a collegiate level, how has that kind of changed over your time as an educator in regards to shifts in diverse conversations related to history? And has like your teaching changed over that time as diversity and inclusion changed?
He just sort of
Just
flung it out there for us to do in the next section.
That's a really good complex question. For me, I think for each of us, well, I can't speak for everybody. For me, it goes back to my background. I grew up in California. I'm not from here. Many of my students know this. I went to high school in Southern California, in a very, very diverse environment, a very, very large high school. Almost 5,000 students, which is a very different experience, as you might imagine, than other environments. When I taught high school, before I went to teach college, I taught at a high school that was 97% Hispanic. And so that was also a very different experience as a white male teaching at that school. And so the ideas of diversity and languages of diversity really haven't been part of my conversation coherently as an educator. As a professor, as I got into doing history and understanding history, that kind of followed along with my teaching, just my understanding of the human condition, like Matt was saying, that it's complex and it's our job to understand that we're all interrelated, and it's not just about studying the dead white guys. It's about this experience that is much different than we might just imagine.
My experience was the exact opposite. I'm from a very small town, rural Texas. I never laid eyes on a person of color until I got to high school. Everybody in my hometown of about 240 people is in some shape, form, or fashion related to me. It is scary. There aren't any six fingers yet, but we are moving that direction sometime, I think, my cousin. But at any rate, yeah, so like for me, believe it or not, my journey started with religion. I wanted to see a world bigger than the very narrow view that I grew up in, an incredibly fundamentalist, evangelical, small town Texas. I knew it had to be bigger. So what do? I go to the largest Baptist university in the world. I go to Baylor, and believe it or not, my religion teacher was a Jewish rabbi. And he really was the one responsible for pointing out within the Torah and the Old Testament, not the same thing, by the way, pointing out the diversity that's actually represented in those texts. And that sort of got me thinking a bit more about, this mosaic that makes up the human condition and all the various colors and viewpoints and everything that make it up. And honestly, the only reason that I got into classical studies was because I was required to take a language, and I had a choice between a language that was 5 days a week and one was 3 days a week. I chose the 3 days a week. And so that got me into, classical studies, which is primarily white. And so I had this period where, it was just me sort of getting the foundation, and it has honestly only been since I've been at Northwest, where I feel at times like I'm back in small town Texas, with the fact that it is not a very colorful fabric here at times, that has sort of had me seeking out more of that and trying to find ways to bring those colors, those viewpoints, those ideas back into the classroom. And that goes to, the readings that we assign, those kinds of things. That's hard in ancient studies because most people couldn't read or write. It's your upper class white guys that have to read or write, right? So it becomes very, very difficult, which means I have to build the narrative from the fragments and the evidence. So it has become a mission to find a way to do that. I'm fortunate that my classical studies brethren are really good at posting things on Twitter. It helps me find things, but it has sort of been kind of a crusade, a mission to try to find ways to bring those diverse voices in. And I say this for a reason. We have a nasty tendency at times to look upon the ancient Greek and Roman world as somehow this bastion of equality and democracy. It has served the foundation of this country very well to believe that the ancient world was monolithic. It was anything but. And if it's one thing we've learned in ancient world this semester, we know that the aristocracy intentionally engineered the system against the lower classes and against the marginalized. They straight up actively did it. And they recorded it. Thank God for that, I guess.
And so we're back to power and
And so we're back to power.
I think the other thing I would say is that most of us are about the same age up here, right? And I was thinking about this question earlier today, and one of the things that I was thinking about was growing up in the 1980s and 1990s, right? There was this, I don't know, maybe it's not true for everybody, but I think most of us were educated in like this history of American exceptionalism, right? Where all the things that we did were good, and now we've moved towards this kind of like, post-racial society and
Manifest destiny.
right. And I think that, at least for me, that had a significant impact on me, not in a good way, right? Because you have this narrative and they tell you, and then you go to college and you're like, oh my God, there's so much other stuff, And so I think that, at least for me, that was incredibly motivating, right? To find out what's the other side of that. Like Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, but he's a slave owner. We don't talk about that part, right? We talk about this part in the 1980s and 1990s, if that makes sense.
So one thing in response to your question that I don't feel like a lot of the material that I have used or talked about has changed. Because I think I've always used a lot of kind of documents and material and stories from a really broad array of people in my classes. But it has felt very different teaching it over the last 10 years. 2016, there was a marked shift in student reception to the same documents and exactly the same stories and the same conversations, where all of a sudden talking about or teaching certain things about diversity or about immigration and anti-immigration kind of policies in the US felt they were all of a sudden politicized. And students started to feel like this became like, I'm teaching you this as like a liberal professor and you're trying to change my politics. And I'm like, I swear I taught the same stuff last year. Like it's not. And so it's been trying to balance that, right? In the kind of student perception that exists, and it's complicated. And I spend a lot of time just like looking at a PowerPoint slide and be like, okay, how are people going to like interpret this? Are they going to interpret it in a different way now than they did before? Like, how do I encourage different kinds of ways of thinking about this? Because it's not really about me trying to tell you one specific way to think about it, right? But it's me presenting the stuff and be like, okay, let's figure out like what's going on here. Like, and if we're talking about something that was 100 years ago, like, yeah, sometimes it sounds exactly like the way things are said today, but I'm not necessarily trying to make like a political statement with that. It's like, well, how come people 100 years ago were saying that? And also, how come today we're still saying exactly the same thing, right? What does that say about us? But it gets messy because we just kind of want to, and I say we as in society, I feel like we just want to like make everything political now, and it makes it's kind of hard and scary sometimes, but at the same time, I feel like it makes it even more important to then have those conversations. Because we don't really want to have hard conversations with people we don't agree with. We want to like exist in our own social media world and friend group and like not ever have to interact with something that's different than what we are, what we believe.
Yeah, and that goes to the heart of what history really is. I mean, I hate to refer to the t-shirt again, but if history is making you feel good about yourself, if it's reaffirming what you already believe without any critical thought, it's not doing its job. Because what it is that history does is meant to challenge those norms, those understandings, and make us as a society become a little bit more self-reflective and go, is that really the way we want to do things? And if it's not, here's our opportunity to change. And here's all of these examples of how it went wrong the first 500 times, right? And here's how we should be moving forward. So, when we're teaching these topics in the classroom, and I agree, 2016 was really the linchpin, that catalyst moment when it feels at times like there's an added stress to putting together a simple lecture that you might think has got nothing to do with any of this, but you know full well there is a connection to be made that is going to set people on edge. And on some levels, I look forward to putting the edge out there to sort of getting people to kind of feel a little bit uncomfortable. And then there's other times when I'm kind of like, I really don't want a parent to call me. And in case you guys wonder, just because we're college professors, it doesn't mean we don't hear from parents. We do. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that kind of just leads me to a follow-up. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like most of our parents are similar in age to most of you on the panel.
Ow, that
right?
hurts.
I suppose. But with that, it's kind of the same thing that Ernest was saying, you know, that our parents were learning very similar things to things you all are being taught. And I mean, regardless of where you're from, whether it's a high school or a small town of, 500 people versus 5,000 people, whatever it might be, there was a similar, I feel like, narrative being taught, especially in lower level, K through 12 education, simply for the fear and subjectivity and pressures of politics on state public schools and things like that. And even, despite the fact that, public schools are funded by the state, even in private schools, they don't want to talk about that because, I mean, one, like oppressive religion stuff, not to say that religion is oppressive, but it is. Undeniably, sorry if you guys disagree. But then also in addition to that, like there is an uncomfortability to talking about subjects of diversity and inclusion, especially when you're an educator trying to speak objectively about this history, right? And so I guess my question is, have you noticed that? And for those of you who have taught in like K through 12 versus now, and I guess kind of leading into critical race theory, like I kind of just want to dive into the conversation of critical race theory now and how that has kind of like narrowed the mind of a lot of people, I feel like, coming into college and even made people resistant to college because there seems to be even a political agenda to attending college, especially for a lot of my like small town friends. They're like, well, I don't really go because one, I have a plan for my life, but two, like it's just a bunch of liberal elites trying to teach, like shove an agenda down your throat. Like, yeah, they say they're trying to teach you to be a professional or whatever, but really you don't need that. So I don't know, what is your guys' kind of perspective on all that?
There's a lot to unpack there.
There's a perfect meme for that from like years ago that had, I'm not gonna say it exactly correctly, but it's something along the lines of like from the professor's point of view, and it's like, gosh, they're always telling me that like this is not me, okay, but it's like I'm always hearing that like I must be like in like making them all these students communists and
Yes, you're
like
indoctrinating
and then
them.
indoctrinating them
Right.
with liberal communism. And then like the response from the professor is like, I can't even get them to like read the chapter for class. Like, yeah, where does this indoctrination go?
If only. I will say that I think that the anti-higher ed piece of your question really predates the summer and the critical race theory debate. We've been seeing a lot of pushback in recruitment efforts. At this institution, but of course our peer institutions across the state are experiencing this as well. And so I think that particular piece is sort of a separate piece because I don't think it's necessarily connected to that. I think the critical race theory, that whole debate is exacerbating the problem, but it was a problem that was already there. The critical race theory piece, that has become sort of, a political firebrand that it's like, oh, well, this tribal group, says this is a bad thing and I like them, so I'm going to jump on board even though I don't know what critical race theory is.
But that's the key, right? Is that they're using it in a way that is incorrect, right? They're taking that label and they're using critical race theory to basically summarize all diversity and inclusion efforts, right? When that's not what it is, right? That's a graduate level theory that's taught in law school. Those two things are not the same, right?
Well, and pushes by state government and the federal government to limit what is taught is not a new thing. This was exactly a conversation we were having in Arizona when I was in graduate school, because the Arizona legislature, which prided itself on having the most members at that time in the early 2000s in the state legislature of people who had not graduated from high school, served as state legislators. They passed legislation saying that like they banned certain the only book really about Hispanic history in the US, that could no longer be taught at high schools in Arizona. And so like it's not, anytime we like think these things are like new.
Oh, no.
They're not new. They just kind of rear their head every now and then.
Yeah,
And
the
we're
flashpoints.
Yeah, and we're definitely going through a period now where we have kind of states that are passing laws against the teaching of certain kind of like diversity topics and specifically race. We also have states that are passing laws banning the teaching of LGBT history and identities. So you've got, but as I say that, you also have a growing number of states. Like a year ago, only 5 states had legislation that required that LGBT history was taught. Now, this year, it's 9 states. So we often don't hear about that's happening, but we hear like the thing where you're like, I can't believe it. It sounds like this is 50 years ago. How is it illegal to talk about like LGBT history in a high school? But it's actually, that number of states is actually dropping. But as you have the growth here, then you've got the pushback here, right? So it just is very public.
The whole thing is fascinating to me at the same time, because at the same time that you have all of these states dealing with legislation about all of this, none of the states think history is important enough to become part of the standardized exams that you all have to take to say, I'm competent and have to get the hell out of school, right? So they're sitting there saying, well, you're not that important, and let's have your football coach teach your history class while we're at it, right? Let's be honest, okay? We're not, history's not that important, but we're gonna legislate what those coaches can teach. I mean, it's this really weird paradox.
Well, and then on top of it, and I'm coming from a very different place. In New York State, I had to take 2 history exams in order to graduate from high school.
Only New York.
Only the Regents exam system is a special kind of heck. But I mean, at the same time, I think we're gonna not to be overly optimistic, because we have some serious challenges that are an immediate problem right now. But just reiterating a little bit Dr. Ford's comment as well. For the first time, my mom teaches high school in a small town in upstate New York, and about 4 years ago, that demographically, tipped the edge, took over. So they are now a majority minority school district, which actually means that they look like your generation across the country, right? They're like 40% white, 20% black. So I don't know, about 20% Hispanic, and then a large South Asian population. So the country is just changing. And when we've seen changes like this in the past, there's often a reactionary pushback, and people in power use the tools they have, and those tools are institutions, and schools are institutions. Hospitals are institutions, to get into my subfield. The immigration system is an institution, and they are weaponized. Voting, thank you.
Can I do it? Museums are institutions. If you are not aware, last week about LGBT history in Kansas City was installed at the Missouri State Museum, and there were complaints from several legislators about that, and it was removed the same week that it was put up because of the governor. The governor of Missouri called for the removal of that exhibit because it was not appropriate to talk about LGBT history in the Missouri State Museum, which is in the state capitol. So you certainly have control by institutions to limit not just what is taught in schools, but what you're able to access in different venues. And as historians, as museum professionals, that's kind of the power of professional, or power, but we like to think the power of our professional organizations, because immediately the Missouri Association for Museums and Archives has been creating a statement about that. The National Council on Public History has created a statement about that, where they are calling for the governor to change that position. He has agreed to put it up in a room off-site. So that wasn't the compromise they were looking for. But
Well, I think one of the things to bring this, that I had heard about CRT and the recent kerfuffle, let's call it that, over CRT. I was listening to a podcast, Code Switch, from NPR. I listen to it every once in a while, not all the time, but every once in a while.
I listen to it every week.
She
I
was-
love her. And then I tell him, I'm like, hey, go listen to this one because.
Go
Right.
ahead, you're such a
Okay,
nerd.
so here we are. So the episode that they were talking about, what they were talking about was moral panics, right? And that CRT is the newest version of a moral panic. See, and going back to that generational thing, our generation, our parents freaked out over video games.
And
Right.
satanic panic.
Oh, and the satanic.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, and
yeah,
The Simpsons.
yeah. that
And
too.
sensitive.
I went
So,
on and watched
but
The
there are all these different versions of the moral panic, right? What's gonna happen to our young people? Just imagine what could happen. We are, of course, corrupting the youth.
Which, by the way, is what Socrates was condemned for and took the hemlock.
Yep.
See, it's not new.
No.
Why do we study history? To understand the present, so we can think about the future, change the future, maybe. You know, and so CRT is this newest version of that moral panic where we don't really, where society doesn't know what it exactly is, can't label it
Because
Right.
it's changing.
because it's constantly changing or it's just scary enough to be something that we should be scared of. We have to listen to the experts who happen to be on TV, who can tell us to be afraid, but don't really know what it is either. And then, of course, it comes down to young people. And where's their power? Well, it's to change policy over what's being taught in schools. The trick is at what level of education? When they're legislating K-12 education, that's one thing. It's something else to legislate at higher education and at the state college level or at the university level. And that's something else that I think that we need to be aware of and to really push back on in the sense of academic freedom and the role of professors as professionals.
So I think some of that comes from an oversimplistic understanding of history, the idea that it's a zero-sum game where you can't make room for new stories or else you're going to push out the old ones and they're going to be completely forgotten. And I think then.
Oh, right, you take down statues and history's gone.
Right, no one knows about it anymore, right? But I think that sort of faux outrage takes the place then of having these very uncomfortable but necessary conversations that we need to have regarding parts of our own history that we should feel ashamed about and that continue to affect our fellow people within our community even today. So I think it's that solar simplification of history.
Do any of you feel that, because it sort of felt this building something or other for the last few years. Do you ever feel like we're sort of heading on this train downhill without the brakes? That something is coming, it seems like every news break, there is some big thing coming. You know, our last 2 summers have been dominated by some rather big things. This week was the Robert E. Lee statue coming down, right? I mean, it seems almost like every single week there is a big shift. Something big coming down. And for me, that feeling tends to add a pressure, particularly in my classes, since you know your study people will be dead 2,000 years, to make those connections between the ancient past and the present. I feel more compelled to make sure that we're seeing those relationships between that past and that present and this present, because it feels like things are changing so rapidly right now. Am I alone in feeling this?
I guess I don't think I agree, because I feel like if we look at the past like 200 years in US history, there've been like constant like moments of incredible change and shifts in kind of people and voices and power and how we're talking about history and who's able to talk about it. I feel like it's because we're just surrounded by, like, we have access to it all now, right? Like we know about it instantly. It's social media, it's news, it's like all of those things. And it just makes everything feel so like imminent, because like you've got to have something that you're always like updating that news story and you're doing this, and it like it almost starts to feel like that zero-sum game. I mean, maybe it is, and like everything's gonna explode, and that's like, I don't want to think about that. So like I tried not to be on like any of those mediums and platforms, and I was like a much more blissful life.
She's a lot less stressed
Because it's like really stressful when you're just I think we've made everything become so much more. I don't
But
know.
how much of that is the democratization of ideas? I mean, Dana and I talk about this all the time. But you've heard that, all ideas are equal. Bullshit. Yes, I'm gonna say it again, bullshit. All ideas are not equal. This idea of democratization of ideas and social media and the availability of information is complicated.
But a
Which-
little defunded history and defunded philosophy, so we can't tell what the good
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
That
but
also
also-
went first.
Yeah, but that also plays into the whole depth of expertise, right? Everybody, you can go out and Google whatever you want to, and as soon as you read all the stuff, right, like 2 pages worth, you're then an expert, right?
Well,
I
I
don't
think
know.
that's why you should do humanities stuff. This is the
Agreed, yes.
Dr. Boss always had, I don't know if it's still there, I think it's gone now, like a little cartoon on his door that was like, the science fields.
It's
Say
still there.
say you
Oh,
can
the dinosaur
like make a velociraptor.
T-Rex.
The humanities tell you, maybe you shouldn't,
Yeah.
right?
It's a
Like,
bad
so
idea.
we
Why it's a
promote
bad idea.
like the STEM fields as a country, as a university these days, but like, we don't understand the stuff if we're not doing this thinking in the humanities and social sciences. Like, there's incredible value to this. I am flabbergasted why over the last 4 years, people have not been flocking to major in political science and history, because like, oh my God, you should be, when you hear these like things and you're like, what? Kanye West said, Black people were excited to be slaves? Go be a history major. Like, go be a history major. Go major in history education and let's talk about stuff. So yeah, no. We will
So-
give you a team history sticker on your way out.
On that note, so let's wrap up a little bit. What are your hopes for the discipline, for our students, the community, moving forward, not just in terms of the importance and value of history, but also in terms of diversity and social justice? Let's see if we can end on a high note, which will be hard for me because I am a resident pessimist.
So you should start.
No.
Then we can end on the high note.
I'm gonna keep my mouth closed.
I said mine. I think it's more people should do this stuff because we don't know it if we're not doing it. No one's pushing this conversation back and forward and against.
When you say do this stuff.
History,
Just like study it.
right? Yeah, study history, like learn about the past, think critically about it. Because if you're not doing, like,
That's the kicker there. That's that think critically piece.
Well, you're not
The
doing-
analyze, there's a lot, and I know that we've talked about it, some of us have talked about this even within our own university, dare I say this on camera. The analysis is really important. Thinking deeply and asking the hard questions is super important, and I think that we collectively don't do it enough. And to wonder, is this the right thing to do? Should we be, teaching about race? Or should we just freak out because I saw it on TV and therefore I should freak out about it? Right? Or I heard about it and I heard that this is bad or something like that. No, we need to stop and analyze and think and ask questions, the hard questions, not just of the item, but then consult with others and talk with the people who study this stuff and learn from each other. And to build that community of understanding. For me, that's part of my hope with this is to move forward, to create deeper thinkers. Right? To build people who will question things. There's the old sticker of question everything, right? Yeah, question everything. Ask, is this real? Oh, the Matrix is coming out. Is this real? Right? What should we be focusing on? And how should we address it?
If I was gonna be positive about all this, which is hard.
That was an if.
Like, yeah,
Okay.
I'm gonna be. I would say my great hope would be that as a nation, that we could be self-reflective and self-aware enough to look at our past, be able to say, you know what, we've messed up. We're gonna fix it and we're gonna be better. That's what I want for all of us.
So I'm gonna play off of that because mine is that I hope that our students, our community, our nation can understand that recognition is not blame. right? Brittany said in the back, I don't know how many times I said that in race and ethnicity, like, oh my God, I said it over and over, right? But that's the thing, I did, right? Yeah, exactly, see, like every week. Thank you, yeah, but I think that's the thing, right? Like, you can recognize that we did crappy stuff in the past, right? And we can learn from it and move on, but that's not to say, hey, you sitting there right now, you are to blame for this. That's not what this is. So I think getting people to understand that you can recognize and accept that, yes, these things happened, right, does not mean that you are personally responsible for them. Yeah.
But you're personally responsible for helping create the change.
Absolutely, yes. You bet, yeah.
Be the change, be the change.
Yeah.
Right.
Alrighty,
And, oh, wait.
oh,
And then I would just add on that I think I would hope that we could rediscover or perhaps discover the ability to empathize with one another and to recognize that just because we personally didn't experience something doesn't mean that others haven't experienced that.
And that there's value in
And
that.
there's value, absolutely.
yeah, we're on the road to all becoming sociopaths. So we gotta rediscover empathy. Go ahead.
No, I think that's key. I think one thing that I am hopeful about is that particularly those of you who are like in college now, and even younger in high school, I think often have a very clear sense of justice, like when something is right, when something is wrong, and you're not afraid to say it, which is awesome. I have students making the connections between past and present now more than I did as like a TA at Notre Dame, like 6-7 years ago, for sure. But it's that next piece, it's that empathy, it's that making connections rather than just identifying like, okay, this is something really wrong and I'm angry about it, or I'm confused about it, and making connections with other people to make change. That's not.
This makes me hopeful, right? And the fact that we're sitting here talking about these things when so many others are unwilling to do so, or do not feel safe to do so, right? My students make me hopeful, right? I look at every generation, they've been doing this for a long time, and each group that comes in, they have a different perspective on it, right? And that's why I enjoy teaching, is I learn all the time from you all, because you bring different things. You're all unique, and that's what I think diversity is a recognition that we are all unique in our experiences, right? And if we can also recognize that we're limited to our experiences, we can then begin to talk to one another, right? Out of recognition that I don't know everything, and neither do you, but together we can go and find something else out.
Alrighty, any questions from the floor, or do we blow your minds?
You're excited to go back to all your history classes tomorrow.
And you're all gonna ask questions.
If you could leave us with one thought, whether as a group or individually, as to why this conversation between students and professors, but also people of different generations, people with different life experiences, and the purpose behind diversity and inclusion, what would that be?
Oh, that was lots of pack.
Embrace it. That's what I'll say.
Yeah.
What I'll say. Embrace it.
I think these discussions are important because they bridge the generational divide. Too often, I'm sure you guys have heard this, millennials, Gen X, well, I'm Gen X, so we get ignored. But Gen Z, right? You know, you have this sort of generational divide that every generation is a screwball generation is gonna amount to nothing. Conversations like this, where you can see us sharing our ideas, our worries, our concerns, or even our struggles with our own place of business, what we work with, what we do, I think provides us with a little bit of level setting that you probably wouldn't get otherwise, right? That you know, we're humans, we're goofballs, in case you didn't pick that up, right? And even though we might be as old as your parents, thank you for that. Everybody but Sarah, of course.
I'm probably Devlin.
I was doing the math.
But I think the cross-generational talks are just as important as the cross-racial discussions, the cross-gender discussions, the cross-religious discussions, so on and so forth. And it breaks down silos. It's very, very easy for us to stay with our particular group of friends and develop into this tribalism that basically makes us myopic to the world around us. So conversations like this with us and with you and your friends, with people of difference, help to sort of break down those silos, right? It really helps to tear down those walls that separate people. The only way that we get change for the positive is when those walls are gone. Building walls historically is a bad idea. Don't believe me, ask Rome. Look what happened to them, right? Building walls is bad. So to move forward for positive change so that your children have a better experience than you have, we've got to have these conversations. We have to share our viewpoints and we have to come to some sort of common ground.
Hashtag build communities, not walls.
Nice. There you go.
Oh, yeah. Right. Anything else?
Where do you think we're heading next? Just because it's been such a politically, just like everybody's been separated politically with their opinions lately, and how we're all growing and becoming more diverse. Where do you think we're going in the next couple of years or so?
To speak on that. So we are really good at being historians. We are really bad at predicting the future.
Yeah, prognostication, not our strong suit.
We are really good at analyzing the past. And what we get to do is make the small little changes we think that we think are important. But guessing what's gonna happen in the future, we don't have jobs doing that.
The best
Because
we
people
can
do that have jobs doing that, don't keep their jobs very long.
No, they don't.
They're wrong.
They get accused of being biased and having an agenda. The best that we can do is give you examples from the past when things were similar. And learn to make decisions and draw conclusions from that, but we can't predict where we're going. I mean, I can look back at the ancient past and I see some very significant parallels between what we're experiencing in our culture right now and the very thing that Rome experienced as the Roman Republic was collapsing and we end up with the assassination of Julius Caesar. We are clearly on a similar path. But the next time that anybody tells you that history repeats itself, yell bullshit. Because it doesn't. It's similar. It's like Mark Twain said. It rhymes,
Yeah.
right? But it, to be able to predict where we're going, I can sit there and say that it's similar to places we've been, things we've done.
I will say that there are many, many points in the past where people were worried in the same way. And that is maybe a common human feature, that humans look at what's all going on all around them and go, what might happen to the children if they are taught this thing? Or if these people invade our schools, or this idea gets, communism, or whatever the thing is, right? Whatever panic sets in. And people are worried about the future, absolutely. But that's part of what we get to do as historians, is say, yep, that's part of the human experience. All right, what's next?
There should be some comfort in that too.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. I think that social media exacerbates stuff, and I'm all over the Twitters and everything else. But the Twitters.
Okay.
Yeah, and it can make it that much worse. But at the same time, we know that this is one of those human features.
This is one of the interesting and sometimes frustrating things about the fact that we are interested in interconnections and interdependency in history, that we cannot build you a nice equation or formula. We don't reduce people to variables, and therefore we cannot do math and try to figure out what happens. But when some social sciences do that, they tend to be run anyway.
Sorry, Emily.
I'm with you.
Cultural geography.
I was talking about economists, we don't have any of those. We're gonna wrap up and then
Yeah.
people want more conversations one-on-one.
Hang on a second. Question, go ahead.
How would you guys and using past examples deal with the current
I can't think of anything in the ancient past that has an equivalent, because the Greeks and the Romans, if you were a criminal that required incarceration, they would A, kill you, or B, put you on a deserted island. So there isn't really anything in that. Now, I'd also like to point out that part of our industrial prison complex, to use your phrase, is actually mired down in certain religious values. To use your phrase, it's oppressive at times. And I'm going to be frank here, Christianity and its belief that humanity is inherently sinful is contributing to this idea that somehow people have to be incarcerated and punished, and that they're not rehabilitated, they can't be redeemed, right? The ancient world didn't have that kind of way of thinking about things, mostly because if you look at their gods, rape, incest, come on. If you're gonna imprison a Greek, you're gonna have to imprison Zeus. Good luck with that. Yeah.
I have some, not expertise per se, but I do spend somebody who looked at prisons in the early republic. So going back, I mean, I think, honestly, I think the way to deal with the roots of our system go back to the period right after the American Revolution, maybe not the industrial component of it, but the idea of incarceration rather than temporary punishment, which is how the early modern world dealt with things. There's very few people who were like in prison for long periods of time. You had lots of people who were publicly humiliated or like branded on the thumb and stuff like that, or beaten or up to execution. So the roots of our system, and this is where it's important to start to think about consequences too, actually come out of reform efforts to try to be more humane than those systems, and are about rehabilitation and moving people back into society rather than, and limiting the number of capital punishments, because there were lots of things that just killed you before 1800. And it came out of a fundamental reevaluation of what society's values were. That's what revolutions are good for. I think we often focus on the scary bad parts of revolution, but the good parts is it makes you rethink society. And I think essentially it boils, I'm rambling, but I think it boils down to actually caring. Like caring and putting those values forward and trying to just rework something from the ground up that actually reflects what we want out of society. And until, maybe this is pessimistic of me, but until people care, and I hope that's changing, I think that's the only way for people to fundamentally refuse to go along with what's happening right now.
I think we're heading that direction. Rehabilitative corrections is sort of a thing.
Yeah, well, and even things like in like podcast plans, like I learned a lot by listening to I'm blanking now. It'll come back to me.
We need one of our criminologists in here to answer this question.
Yeah, that's true too.
For-profit prisons. That's probably where it started.
Yeah.
Get him out of the private sector.
So wait, could you restate that question?
Like, how would we deal with industrial, using past examples, how would we deal with, or even modern examples, how would we deal with our current prison systems? Like, I got out of prison a year ago.
I don't know if you guys mind, but I'd like to kind of touch on what I know. I mean, I do both sociology, criminology, and psychology, but I do have insight on this, even as a student. I think in regards to that, a lot of the prison population and the prison system as it is right now is very politicized, just like a lot of our systems that exist in our current state of democracy. And so I think the biggest thing is, I mean, especially us as, people going into professional field, going into potentially legislation, policy reform, things like that, we have an opportunity to kind of I wouldn't say right the wrongs, but to do what we can to change some of the things that have really inhibited a lot of oppressed and suppressed a lot of the populations that are represented in our prisons, which is, as it relates to this conversation, a lot of minority populations. The war on drugs in the 60s, you guys can talk about this as professors. Was a big thing, but also in the modern
My
day
mom was
today.
born in the 60s. What the hell?
Well, As a historian.
Oh,
yeah.
Comments on it.
Took me a second, I was like, what?
Yeah, but I think a lot of it revolves around policy, because, it's for-profit, private, you know, and a lot of that comes from, well, industrialization, sure. But now, in our day and age, for a lot of us, like, technology has a big impact on the changes that we can make towards things like this. We talk about the injustices of the prison system, and we've seen that people are taking action against the wrongs that are occurring as a result of the structure and foundation of the prison system. And so, I mean, you could talk about history and use those as examples to kind of correct it, but I think there's a lot of opportunity in modern society to correct that.
By the way, I looked up the title. It's Ear Hustle. I'm very sad that I forgot the name of it, but it's great and it's produced out of San Quentin Prison in California.
Oh, yeah, I'm a criminology person in here.
Just to add on to what you're saying, in our justice theories class, we touched on this problem of like prisons, and we learned this concept of usually, I think that's what the term is, of prisons, and how the idea of prisons is so inherent in our culture that until we fix our mindset of like needing prisons, then we can't get rid of prisons itself and think more rehabilitative ways.
Yeah.
And this is probably where history becomes important, because there have been times in the historical past, and there are cultures today that do not have prison systems. So, there are other answers to the question. And I think, sort of to wrap us up here for the evening, you guys are poised to be able to make those changes. And this is where the glories and wonders of having university education come into play, is because you're getting all of these different ideas and these different viewpoints from different disciplines across the campus. And it's not just us, right? I mean, you're getting it from your other faculty and other departments as well. That you're getting all these different ways of thinking about things, and that positions you guys very, very well to be able to go and make the changes to make our society better. No pressure at all. I need you to say Social Security so that I can retire. But in all seriousness, there comes a point when we as historians have to pass the baton on to the next generation. And as academics who teach, what we do when we're in the classroom is that process of handing you guys the baton so that you guys can begin doing it, right? So thank you for coming tonight. I'm sure some of us will hang up here for the next few minutes. If you guys should want to come up and talk one-on-one, you're more than welcome to. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you were not joking about that.
Oh, I thought it was-
Yeah, if you need
But
points,
you know,
the great logo.
Yeah, we do have teams.
Oh, also, if you live on campus, please see me. I'm gonna get all points.
Ah.